Hello and welcome to this week's instalment of the WhatsOnStage Podcast with me, Sarah Crompton.
And me, Alex Wood.
I'm still away on my sort of holiday, sort of work. I'm at the Venice Dance Biennale, and very oddly, for the first time in my experience, really, being in Venice is like being in England. There was an amazing day last week where the weather in Venice was worse than the weather in Manchester because I was watching the cricket, and it's been an interesting stay in Venice. I've come to Venice a lot in my life and never quite experienced this weather, which is very nice, actually. It's, moderate temperature, nice to walk around. But if you're coming for the first time and expecting sunshine, I suspect it must be very disappointing. How is it in sunny England, Alex?
Oh, I am basking in t-shirt and shorts. The sun cream is out, factor 50 on. No, it is very... To be fair, it's not as warm as it was a few weeks ago. It has just been very pleasant to us. There was a shower on a Saturday, and I always think about whenever there's a shower on a Saturday, it reminds me of my wedding day when it completely chucked it down, and that was a Saturday in July. So my wife and I look at each other mournfully whenever we see it happen again, because we think of all the other couples that might have their big day ruined.
Yeah.
So I keep track of rain in the summer on Saturdays, but no, it has been absolutely glorious weather, perturbingly so. My grass is very brown at the moment.
Okay. I have no idea what my grass is like, obviously.
Yeah, you're swanning it up and having a wonderful time. I feel like this is the classiest, bougiest experience a critic can have, is being a sort of like jet-setting across to Italy to review dance in all its glory.
I could be having a more bougie time. Some of my colleagues sort of jump between festivals, actually, which perhaps I'll consider next summer, because there are an awful lot on and an awful lot of very good new work coming out. I am returning from here, obviously, to go to the Edinburgh Festival, but there's the Avignon Festival and the Lyon Festival and all kinds of places that you can go. So some of my colleagues have been doing that. It's been interesting being here with the debate about criticism going on, because obviously I am with critics and I am working and I am indeed writing about dance, not about theatre this week. And it's been really interesting, the reactions to the New York Times story, which you discussed so brilliantly with David Gordon on last week's podcast, where the New York Times has decided to move 3 of its critics to different beats, essentially, in terms of reshaping its coverage for the future. And Richard Brody, the film critic of The New Yorker, someone I read and admire, has written the most eloquent response in defence of traditional criticism, which has, been a subject of discussion in places I've been hanging out, obviously, with other critics. But I did think it was the most eloquent and passionate defence of why you need critics and why. I know that I would say this because it's my career, and I think I've said before that I'm slightly peculiar, that I did start off my journalistic life wanting to be a critic. It was an aim, but I wanted to be a critic and to write about dance because I had learned so much from the traditional critics who came before me, and I think that's one of the things we might talk about. Are people still talking about it in your where you are?
Yeah. It's such an interesting one, because that leaked memo about the New York Times critics, including Jesse Green, the theatre critics, being repositioned, as you say, comes with it a degree of uncertainty. We won't really know what repositioning means, or who might, for example, be taking up the mantle when it comes to reviewing shows for the next Broadway season from the autumn onwards, and whether or not the New York Times will still commit to reviewing an entire season or shows off Broadway or off Broadway. So at the moment, I think everyone's sort of like waiting with bated breath to see what this new New York Times landscape might look like. At the same time, as mentioned with David, there is the point that theatre criticism is evolving, and that was part of why it was so lovely that we could kickstart the podcast a year ago, is because it added another means of discussing reviews and discussing what a review can achieve, or discussing what are our opinions or thoughts are on shows that might go beyond what you can write down on the page. But reading through the New Yorker profile from Richard Brody last night, I think in a way it slightly enabled me to fall in love again with that printed written word review, because you can get very excited about the newfangled or the podcast or the video review or the TikTok review. But there is that purity and that joy that comes with sitting down at a desk for X number of hours and finding words to articulate feelings in a way that operates very differently to if you're talking on a podcast. And he almost romanticizes the idea of criticism again. And I think so often criticism is seen as a cynical and snarky thing to do. But for someone to say, this is a really beautiful art form, and actually the conversation that comes from criticism can cut through to what is essentially at the heart of human existence in terms of what culture means and what art means and what community means and what connection means, was really quite galvanizing. And I think that amongst whatever the New York Times is doing, it's important that we remember those individuals and what an individual can achieve as a critic, that might be swaddled in all this debate about technological innovation.
Yeah, I think it is a fine balance. I think you're right, we don't quite know. But for me, in terms of my journalistic life, it rings some horrifying bells, what's happened on the New York Times. So Richard Brody's argument is that the long form review, or the review, represents an extended engagement with a unit of culture, and that from that extended engagement with a unit of culture, many, many things spring. So you're talking, if you're doing it properly, you're talking about the past, you're bringing your knowledge of culture to bear, but you're essentially also talking about the future. And and that's his main point. That's the point of review, the future. And I think that's the bit that resonates most loudly with me, because when I was first starting reading dance reviews specifically, I didn't know about the past. So I was learning about the past from reading writers like John Percival, Clement Chris, Fernell Hall, Mary Clark, great generation, Joe Nakachella, New Yorker, incredibly important dance critic to me. But I was also learning about the future, because he gives an example of a Beethoven concert, that if you're reviewing a Beethoven concert, you're not just reviewing the Beethoven concert, you're putting it in the context of where you are now and what will happen next. And I think that's really key. And I remember when I began as an editor, and indeed really for my whole time as an editor and as an arts editor, the constant conversation was, why do you want to go and review? I mean, it was actually interestingly always focused around music and dance and opera, which are seen as single high culture events that nobody really cares about. That's the idea. And the argument always was, why are you going to review a performance of Elgar in Manchester when it's over and nobody will have seen it? And my argument back was, because that performance of Elgar is part of all the conversations about performances of Elgar. It's part of people who love classical music, them understanding what's going on at the moment and looking towards what will happen next. And it's also a means of introducing other people who are music students or whatever to this, a concept about a performance of Elgar. I think two things have really happened in reviewing that worry me, and that I feel that the New York Times is bending into. One is the idea that everybody can review everything, which we once did as an experiment on the Telegraph. We all swapped roles. And it was really, really interesting, because it proved that at some levels, everybody can review everything. Everybody can write quite an interesting essay on everything. But not many people can write something that brings knowledge, insight, and expertise. It's really quite hard to go and write about dance if you don't know a bit about dance, or theatre if you don't know a bit about theatre, or film if you haven't watched quite a lot of film.
The excellent bit that stood out to me from Richard Brody's essay that kind of leans into what you're saying is, what's left is the curse and the shrug of the interesting. Say, for example, if you don't have these people who live and breathe these art forms, a non-aesthetic approach that puts art before readers as a curiosity, as a set of talking points rather than as a formal rather than as a form of personal experience, of devotion, of passion. The heart of the review is emotion, the stirring of the soul, receptiveness to the life-changing power of art, even commercial art. Personality-centered formats rooted in reporting or in talk are art from the ego, more like homework or social capital. And though criticism is obviously subjective, at another level it is resolutely objective, a form of reporting from within. And like you say, if you're going to get someone from architecture going to review, I don't know, The Great Gatsby in the West End, yes, of course they're going to be able to say something relatively interesting, but have they seen 6 different versions of The Great Gatsby over the last 10 years? Have they heard different interpretations of F. Scott Fitzgerald's work placed on the stage? Do they? And I think what is often forgotten when we are critics is that responses to shows aren't static. We have an opinion on a show, but that opinion can evolve as we evolve as people. So a show that you see in 2012 or 2015 can still be part of the conversation that you have with yourself and with the art that you witness 10 years later. So we have to allow ourselves as critics to evolve and mature like fine wine, rather than be like Ribena coming in and just having a short burst of sugar. I don't know why I've gone down that metaphor avenue, but for some reason it's there. And it just means that criticism feels quite a romantic passion. It sort of leans into something very classic about being able to surround yourself by brilliant artists and creatives with fantastic insights and ideas, and just being in conversation with them, often for decades at a time. And we're losing that. Like you say, this isn't TripAdvisor culture.
Yeah.
We want people that can exist in these structures for their entire lives and come out with some incredible insights that might never have otherwise existed.
And the other thing is that it is seeing art as a commodity, which is a pressure that is being applied in numerous areas of the modern age. One of the ways that the arts and culture has had to defend itself is to say we make a lot of money. And that is true. And again, is, pertinent in Venice. Art and culture is one of the main earners for the city, right up there with tourism. The biennales, which have pioneered new work, have introduced new artists, whether it's Pina Bausch or Marina Abramovic, to the world, are very important to this city and to this place. So, that is important, but that has led to a sort of commodification of art, because art does have a purpose in and of itself. And that's always the problem that you get into when you're having these arguments, because people who don't care about it don't see that. They see the idea that it earns money and that it entertains and that it can reach a wider or a smaller audience, but they don't necessarily want to argue its value. And I always come back to the same thing about sport. Sport is a thing in and of itself. So the Lionesses winning, which is this week's big story, is a kind of brilliant cultural moment, and everybody feels a bit better and it's got a news value and all the rest of it. But it also has that match, that moment and so on. You needed people who understood it and who could put it in context, to write about it, to explain it, and so on. There's been some wonderful writing around the Women's Euros by a lot of really knowledgeable people. And I have learned a lot about Spanish women's football, about English women's football, about the development of the game, about the way it's played, from experts who have written at length. Now, I've also learned a lot from podcasters, people who speak, and news reporters, but those are different experiences. And I do think it's always significant that nobody ever says, let's take all the sports correspondents off their brief. Nobody ever doubts that it matters to bring knowledge and history and expertise to writing. And sports reporting has, it's evolved, but it hasn't gone. And so I think there is a really there's a dangerous precedent. You need all the different forms, and it's great to have vlogs and videos and interviews and essays and all those things. But essentially, the fundamental unit of the match report matters. And I think that's exactly the same with reviewing. And as I say, what really made me sad about the New York Times leak memo was this sense that it reflected conversations I've had with people over 30 years. And that the New York Times, which is a paper that in so many ways represents that tradition of extraordinary writing, was having that conversation, maybe sad, really. So I think it's good, though, because it has made, people in our sphere talk and think. And perhaps has, I don't know, we'll see.
The New York Times also sits very much at the head of a much more hierarchical reviewing landscape in New York. Less so maybe now than 10 years ago, when Ben Brantley was the chief scribe for the theatre side of things. But if they set a precedent about maybe we don't need a chief critic, maybe we need a plurality of voices, will others follow suit? And I think in the UK, we're possibly further ahead of the US in terms of a lot of big publications have, in the last 10 years, upended their reviewing models and almost taken the personality out of the reviewer, which is really sad in a way that you don't allow your readers to form that connection to the critic. And I think that is one of the most important things you can do, because, if I met a friend and they recommended a show to me, I'll know what their taste is. So I might know if actually that recommendation is one I want to act upon. If you make the critic an anonymous figure, you render the review much more limited as a result. And yeah, I think that's also why we've never replaced reviewing on the website with doing a podcast. We've always thought these things act in harmony. They act in conversation with each other. It's always go and read what Sarah has to say. We're going to reflect on her review in the podcast. And that is where things should stand. You shouldn't see that one replaces the other. There's no fish eating fish. It's all, let's all exist in a nice pond together, different fauna, different flora. I'm going all over the place with the metaphors today.
It is, but they're good metaphors. Yeah. But I think that's absolutely true. And that idea that you form a relationship with the reviewer who you will go to look at. You do look at audience feedback, and sometimes you would look at audience feedback in relationship to something, as with Burlesque. It is important how audiences are reacting to that. So you weigh up, because that's an individual response as well. But it's only one, and you might want this longer consideration of things, and a consideration that is built on having done a bit of research and a bit of thinking, as well as just an immediate visceral response.
Burlesque is such a fascinating case study. And when I was talking to David Gordon on last week's very popular episode, not to blow my own trumpet, it's just clearly people are very excited about what's going on with Burlesque at the moment. The reviews from other critics hadn't come out, so I hadn't heard what everyone else thought. And it has successfully managed to claim the position of quite maybe it's not something you really want, but it's managed to get every single star rating from 1 to 5 from main publications. So
amazing.
5 from The Guardian and London Theatre, 4 from The Telegraph, 3 from myself, The Times, The Stage, and then 2 from the Daily Express, and also possibly from Time Out, although they don't give star ratings under 3 stars nowadays, which is a whole other conversation. And then a damning 1-star review from the Daily Mail, very much the sort of thing that they would want to make headlines with. So, like you say, the subjective response to that show was so interesting. And I was at the press night for Top Hat later that week down in Chichester, and one of the critics was going around being like, oh, you said this, you said that, almost in a way that they were comparing notes with everyone almost to be like, oh, did I say the right thing? Or like, and you do obviously have to stick to your guns and stick to your own personal response. But it's funny that you kind of, all of you sit, like having to sit together and sort of like compare notes and be like, we all watched the same thing, yet had wildly different reactions to it. And I think that's beautiful to some extent. Obviously, Burlesque is swaddled in the controversy that we discussed on last week's episode, but it's quite wonderful in a way that we could all be within the same sort of like 10 square meters and yet come away with very different emotional reactions, either being, oh my gosh, this is one of the best musicals I've ever seen, or oh my gosh, this is one of the worst musicals I've ever seen. And that's so wonderfully human. And I just think that if we lost critics that had that sort of artistic journey, that would feel like such a less interesting thing to have happened.
And they're all critics that have watched a lot of musicals and have thought a lot about musicals. You know, that is the context. That is the expertise. It's not just reading and knowing. It's people who watch and people who are passionate about the art form. And that is what's so fascinating. And, you know, audience members will not see as many shows as a critic simply because, you know, it isn't their job. Arguably, if you were seeing 6 shows a week, then you should be a critic, you know, because that is your job and that is what you're doing. And I think that level of, it is important to keep hold of that idea that you do know stuff. I mean, I'm having a weird time in Venice because there have been 2 dance shows that I am at odds with the audience on. And actually a festival is another. I mean, maybe we should do a piece on festivals, because festivals are another audience again, and they are very, very often people who are passionate about the art form. You know, if you're going to a classical music festival, it's because you like classical music. So I found that interesting because I feel, so I'm writing a review for The Observer at this moment where I'm trying to analyse why I am out of step in my feeling but that is the most truthful thing you can possibly be, is to just try and analyse your own personal engagement with a piece of art. But I'm interested, Alex, in what else you've seen this week. I mean, because I feel that I'm following what's going on, but I'm obviously not seeing anything. So you've seen Top Hat. What was that like?
Oh, so incredible central performances, and I'm actually interviewing the 2 stars of the show later today, so that's fun. Really wonderful chemistry between them, and I know you said you've seen the show in the West End. I think with the Tom Chambers and Summer Strallen it's quite a recent show. It's quite funny because it's based on the 1935 Irving Berlin film with Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, but it was only turned into a musical in 2011, first on tour and then in the West End, and it picked up the Olivier Award for Best New Musical, but it was in a very, very fallow year in terms of new musicals in the West End. So what does that mean? The book itself is pretty baggy, and you kind of like, come on, just get through all this waffling and these sort of like tedious early 2010s jokes so we can get back to the beautiful and dazzling choreography and tap. So the evening felt quite slow until those moments when the dance happened. And the story itself is sort of like, it's all this mistaken identity and romantic angst and frustration and people slapping each other in frustration and sort of like damning critiques of marriage and lots of cynical takes on how marriage is such a chore. But then the moment that the performers all start dancing each other, that cynicism slides away and there's this beautiful, dazzling earnestness and connection between all the stars of the show. And in a way, you think this could really work if the book was a bit more refined and concise and understood that you've got the truth of the dance versus the chaos of the text, and that people communicate best when they communicate through their bodies wordlessly. But yeah, that just didn't come to. Maybe it needed a director that was just going to rattle through the dialogue in a pithy, fast pace, except that sadly didn't come off. But, you know, in terms of entertaining the Chichester crowd over summer, which is what this production needs to do for now, everything was exactly where it needed to be for that to happen. And, you know, you've got all the big Irving Berlin staples like Cheek to Cheek and Putting on the Ritz. and you can't go far wrong with those. With those.
Interestingly, as a fan, particularly of the Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers films, I think it's often a mistake with the musicals of that period that the book writers who then put them on stage try to make them more serious than they are. I mean, I think those great films of the 30s really understood that the script, such as it was, and certainly the story such as it was merely a vehicle to carry the dance. And that is the truth of them. That is what they're there for. They are dance shows. And then you get that really interesting thing with dance, about chemistry. And I was fascinated to notice that everyone who's reviewed Top Hat has talked about the chemistry between the two leads. And on-stage chemistry, maybe again a subject for a podcast, is something we don't often talk about and is so critical in dance. And the thing that sometimes fascinates me in dance is that off-stage couples, who obviously love each other, have not much on-stage chemistry. It can happen. There's something weird. It's as if what you feel for each other is so very great. Whereas on stage, you can just generate this magic spark, really, and particularly with dance. So I'm fascinated that everybody's used that line with it and has felt it. And I've also been fascinated in light of I know the other show you've seen this week is the Andrew Lloyd Webber Jesus Christ Superstar, which you saw at the Watermill. And I'm so interested, again, reading the reviews, of course, reviews matter, from this end, that how brilliantly Lloyd Webber, of all musical writers, is transmuting to a new age and allowing new productions to thrive, really.
The reviews for Jesus Christ Superstar landed the same week as the reviews for Evita at the London Palladium. Both overwhelmingly positive by the large majority of critics, which cemented the fact that, as you say, Andrew Lloyd Webber shows have this renaissance happening right now, and clearly there is something within them that allows the alchemy of revival to take these shows and run with them. The exciting thing about this production of Jesus Christ Superstar, which I did a fun bonus episode for the podcast on, was that Stuart Morley, the musical director, musical supervisor and arranger, had been able to pick apart Andrew Lloyd Webber's score, not in a radical way, but in enough of a way to have active musicians running across the stage performing the score. And that completely altered the way in which you experience the production within the tiny confines of this 200-seat Watermill theatre, that you might at some point have someone with a trombone walking down the aisle next to you, or you've got Judas mulling over his betrayal of Jesus whilst playing away, doing a guitar solo on the electric guitar. And one of the things that struck me, having spoken to the cast, was that the different instruments represented different themes or ideas. Like there's a moment where the flute, for example, really comes in. It's almost like aggressive, and it's attacking Jesus just as he's getting these lashes, the 39 lashes that are used to punish him before he is crucified. That for me was so rich and dexterous, and I just think that comes from the material. It's all there. It's just the way in which you interpret it, and similar in a way to a Shakespeare text, where you can take a single line or a single idea and you can pull that out, and then you can shape an entire production around it. Here, they've taken the depth and the themes within the score and pulled them right the way out, and then built the production around, if we start to dismantle the score, what can we find inside, and what can we use that, and how can we use that to inform the characters themselves. So yeah, I think great time for the Lloyd Webber Renaissance. I really hope the show has a future life, but I can't imagine it being anywhere that isn't as charming and romantic and beautiful as the Watermill, which is a unique and beautiful venue that really couldn't exist anywhere else.
Right. No, that's a shame if it can't go, because I, as I say, I've been reading about it. I think I'd really like to see that. I think it's interesting. I think particularly Jesus Christ Superstar and Evita. I want to pick up on that idea about the music because it relates to something else about Fiddler on the Roof, actually, which I think is interesting about new orchestrators hearing things differently and realising what you can do with a score. But I suspect as well that because both Jesus Christ Superstar, most notably, and Evita had their origins as an album, at some levels, and this is not being at all rude to Tim Rice, who I think is a brilliant book writer, but at some levels he didn't have to worry entirely about the book. What he was creating was this propulsive frame to allow the story to move forward. It's been interesting with Evita at the London Palladium that people have complained, some people have complained, I mean, most people adore it, but some people have complained that they can't follow what is going on. And it does make an assumption of knowledge, that score, in any staging. You have to know a certain amount about Eva Peron to be able to follow it. And this is a tangent. One of the things that struck me about that, of course, is that when it was first staged, her life was much closer to that first staging. So she was probably much more in the general culture than she now is. And so you would have an idea of the broad outline of her life. So I think that's come into play. But just in terms of allowing directors and new creative teams freedom, the fact that these musicals started as an album is actually brilliant, because it means that you can really reimagining the staging without anything particularly intruding on what you feel it should be.
They also enable directors to go in exciting ways with the material, and I think directors are drawn towards blank canvases. And Paul Hart, who directs the production of Jesus Christ Superstar at the Watermill, was saying one of the favourite things is that Jesus Christ Superstar has no stage directions, or very, very few. And that therefore means that you have absolute license to go wherever you want in the way that you portray these characters, in the props that you provide, in the aesthetic that you create. And I think every time I've seen Jesus Christ Superstar, Herod has looked completely different.
Yes.
Even Jesus has looked completely different. This production almost feels like a bedfellow to something like the Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet that ran last December, and that is very much a compliment to say that aesthetically they feel quite similar. I have just to hopefully provide some hope on the horizon. I have heard that there's definitely partners involved that would look to have future life for this specific production. So fingers crossed.
I'd like to see that. But also to pick up on your orchestration theme, that one of my subtasks in my life at the moment is to learn a bit more about orchestration. It is interesting as well that in this new generation of musical directors, people are looking at the scores and deciding how you can make it sound different without at all betraying the composition of it. And obviously the first time I was really conscious of that was with the Oklahoma, with Jordan Fine's Oklahoma, which basically reduces that very rich orchestral score to a band, a guitar band and a country band, I guess. And that rethinking was done by Daniel Kluger, which was just revelatory, really. And I think, and not at all, I mean, like any, you always go back to Shakespeare, it's like any production of Shakespeare, doesn't get rid of the original, doesn't get rid of the original orchestrations, but enables the show to be played and performed in a different way. Same with Fiddler on the Roof, which is still playing at the Barbican.
Just finished, is now about to head off on tour. It'll be entertaining audiences until Christmas, across the UK.
So there you are.
Yes, orchestrations by Mark Aspinall, nominated twice at the Olivier's this year, and one for The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. So he was up against himself. Brilliant work. And you're totally right. The name that also stood out to me was what Alan Williams did with Evita. And I always think, what was it during Rachel Zegler's live stream performance of Don't Cry For Me Argentina that was so emotionally powerful? And while seeing the crowd outside was amazing and watching her on the big screen was amazing, for me, it was the instrumental section of that number where Alan Williams pulls out the brass during sort of like the triumphant moment and the lighting goes huge. And if you listen to other versions of this show, the brass is there, but it's not the center of the attention. But here he makes it majestic and colossal, and it stands out above all the other parts of the orchestra. And I just think you found that in that score and you thought, this is how we can really hammer home the majesty of what Rachel Zegler's doing outside and what this character is going through right now. And almost like dramaturgy, but in a 5D context.
Yeah.
And I'm just, I feel as though we're so lucky to have producers and composers who are willing to allow orchestrators to jump into their work and find those nuggets of gold, but also the people who are educated to the point that they can find that and work it out, because it takes decades of skill and effort to find those, in a similar way to critics, like how we do when we appraise shows. Oh wow, what an excellent way to sum up this episode. But I think orchestrators do that when they look through a score. They'll see, oh, okay, that's that motif that's appearing there. What does that mean that's returning? Or why have they given that tune to that section of the orchestra? We need to make sure we do something with that. In this interpretation of the show, they're downplaying these elements, so that means that these elements of the score we also probably should downplay as well. I just think it's so genius. And I'm so glad that they're being recognised with sort of dedicated awards, whereas maybe 10, 15 years ago they weren't.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I mean, there's a bit on that theme, there's a bit at the end of Fiddler on the Roof, which I won't spoil for anybody seeing it, but which again is that noticing of a theme and doing something with it that is so heartbreaking. If I ever wrote anything as good as that theme, I'd be very, very happy on your critical analogy.
Great. Well, I feel like that's probably a nice touch point to finish this episode of the What's on Stage podcast.
I think it seems perfect.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Sarah, for that critical deep dive. I feel like we've taken the New York Times and run in an entirely new direction and somehow ended up on musical direction instead.
That's what you get from a podcast.
Yes. So it's a goodbye from me, Alex Wood.
And a goodbye from me, Sarah Crompton.
Make sure you like, follow, subscribe, leave a comment, rate, or just generally rave about the podcast wherever you can. We'll be back with regular episodes every Friday and a smattering of bonus episodes in between.